Welcome back to the IAQA Australia podcast. I'm your host, Julian Colangelo. In this episode, we'll be revisiting our webinar from 2020 with Dr. Lidia Morawska, Airborne Transmission of Respiratory Infections. But first, I'd like to introduce our podcast sponsor, which is EnviroXP, my company. I started this company just over 12 months ago, and we provide consulting services for the built environment, focusing on mold, asbestos, hazardous materials, water damage, and air quality. If you'd like to find out more, please visit enviroxp.com.au. A bit of IAQAA news. Our conference is coming up 24th of August on the Gold Coast, to test or not to test. Speakers will be announced shortly, but I'm told that Dr. Morawska will be joining us in person as well. We'll also have Dr. Sama Lochoi to continue the work we began last conference using Bayesian modeling. We also have Ken Larson on establishing category of water damage and Kevin P. Connell on mold air sampling. For more information, visit iaQAAustralia.org.au. Now on to today's podcast. Dr. Lidia Morawska is a world-renowned aerosol physicist and air quality researcher based in Australia. She is a distinguished professor at Queensland University of Technology and director of the International Laboratory for Air Quality and Health, a major research centre focused on air pollution, airborne particles, and their impacts on human health. She's best known for research into airborne particles, indoor air quality and air pollution, leading international efforts during the COVID-19 pandemic to establish that it could be transmitted through air and helping change public health guidance worldwide, and contributing to several air quality standards and guidelines for the World Health Organization over several decades. Some notable recognitions include named to the Time 100 list of the world's most influential people in 2021, Fellow of the Australian Academy of Science, and recipient of Australia's 2025 Prime Minister's Prize for Science for her pioneering work on air quality and airborne disease transmission. So enough for me. Let's get on to the webinar. And if you'd like to share it with your colleagues and friends, would be much appreciated. The hashtag on LinkedIn is hashtag IAQAAPOD. Thanks very much, and see you next time.
So I'll talk a little bit about particle aerosolation in respiratory activities as a background and infection transmission modes, then risk assessment, prospective and retrospective methods, well, all this leading to future guidelines for prevention of airborne transmission. Particle aerosolation in expiratory activities. Well, we would say they result from the passage of an airstream at a sufficiently high speed over a surface of a liquid. Now, where is this surface of the liquid? There are plenty of the surfaces in our respiratory tract as we breathe, as we speak, as we cough, as presented here on this diagram. Well, in a way, this is similar to what happens during a nebularization. I'm sure many of us would have had something to do with a device like this in their laboratory practice, or if not, in a perfume bottle, that old type perfume bottle. In a nebulizer or a perfume bottle, the size distribution which is generated is very simple. It usually has one mode. But in our respiratory tract, because of this many different passages, it is of course much more complex. How does it look like? This is number size distribution resulting from speaking and breathing. Well, first, we need to notice that on the horizontal axis, which is logarithmic, the size distribution of the particles ranges over 4 orders of magnitude. There are more particles here below 1 micrometer, but in the design of our study, we were not able to measure them. We can also see that the size distribution, as I explained before, is quite complex and has several modes. A very important aspect of this is that the majority of the particles are small. These are the particles which can stay suspended longer in the air and linger in the indoor environments where we need to do something with them. Well, you can say that, well, there's a big peak here, so what about this peak? But if you notice that the vertical axis is also logarithmic, so the concentration here of these large particles in this large mode is insignificant compared to these small particles. Where do they come from? The small mode comes from bronchial fluid film burst. When we inhaled and exhaled, a blockage occur, and then during the next inhalation they break, and that's how aerosol is generated. Interestingly, this has been linked to generation of this particular pathogen, H5N1, which is thought to be located in this part of the respiratory tract. This is a very important aspect. The particles are aerosolized from the different part of the respiratory tract, but if there's something else, in addition to the normal constituents of the respiratory fluids, it will be aerosolized as well, and in particular viruses or bacteria. The second mode is laryngeal vibration mode, slightly bigger. And the final one on this diagram, oral speech articulation movement, and this is the interaction of lips, teeth when we speak. And this one has been linked to this particular pathogen located in this part of the respiratory tract. So this is a very important aspect. We've got a complex size distribution with the majority of the particles in the smaller size range. Another important aspect is concentration of particles generated during respiratory activities. Here you can see comparison of particle concentration as a result of different activities. And we have breathing, so it's nose, mouth, breathing, counting, voice, whisper, and also this one, this is similar to singing and coughing. Very importantly, you can see that this vocalization results in the highest concentration of particles. So this is an example from our study, but there have been other studies showing similar demonstrate similar findings. So in particular, in this study by Asadi, you can see that comparison between breathing and speech in terms of number of particles per second, which is emission rates or concentration, anything to do with speaking generates much higher concentrations than with breathing. And also the particles during speaking are a bit bigger than the particles during breathing. Okay, so we've got this background to what's generated, what's introduced to the air and potentially carrying a virus. I'm sure that by this stage of the pandemics, everyone has heard many times about how the infections are transmitted. So by close contact in the range of these large droplets, which generate mainly from the mouth, either being on the direct line of this droplet or touching the surfaces where they're deposited, or by inhalation of the small droplets, which are somewhere in the room further away from where they were exhaled. Well, there are a number of questions related to this or aspects which could be investigated. One of them is, does it make a difference which transmission route? Well, it does in terms of mitigations. I'm sure we've heard, well, it's not I'm sure, I know that we've heard and we hear this every day, many times a day, what to do to protect ourselves against these large droplets. Wash your hands, stay at a distance, disinfect your hands. But no one is talking about protection against small droplets somewhere in the room. So what are the mitigation measures to limit airborne transmission? Building engineering controls, sufficient and effective ventilation, possibly enhanced by particle filtration and air disinfection, avoiding air recirculation and avoiding crowding. Now, these are very simple concepts, but when it comes to execution of what exactly should be this ventilation rate, how exactly this flows in the building or airspace should be, this becomes significantly more complex. Now, another aspect is it easy to find out how a person was infected? There's lots of talks that particularly within the medical community, that the main transmission route is by small, close distance. Well, it is not. It is easy to find out from whom, because we can do, contact tracing and also analysis of the viral content, but not how. by which transmission route. And in fact, that at close distance, we can be infected by the large droplets, but also by the small ones. Such studies are by nature retrospective with incomplete data. We cannot predict that an outbreak would occur. We learn about the outbreak sometime later, and by that stage, it's very difficult to get the data to find out exactly what happens. One of the first outbreaks, which became very well known around the world, is this in the US in Mount Vermont, Skagit choir practice, where out of about 60 people, 45 were infected. Similar situation occurred in this Canadian celebration. It was not choir practice, but it was celebration in this church. The point was that there were no investigators during these events to study the infection transmission routes. Well, how then to say what happened? Retrospective studies, this is an example of a retrospective modeling what happened on the Diamond Princess cruise ship. This was quite complex modeling. Interestingly, showing that the contribution of what they call here long range, which is by aerosols, smaller particles. This is that, by the way, this in the medical community, smaller particles are called aerosols, larger particles are called droplets. It's different in the aerosol science, but it doesn't matter as long as we understand. So aerosols, which means smaller particles, contribute more to transmission mode than the short range, which is both droplets and aerosols, and also the aerosols of the smaller particles is more significant. So this demonstrates the need for tools to be able to prospectively and retrospectively modeling and the risk. Which brings me to the risk assessment. We need the risk assessment tools to, as I said, prospectively and retrospectively analyze what happened. The first point which I'll make here is the complexity of this. If we are talking about, let's say, emission of carbon dioxide from our exhalation and then how it is traced and how it is removed, well, there's just concentration of carbon dioxide, which is very well quantified. However, when we are talking about infection transmission, we are talking about infectious quanta. The quantum is the dose of infectious airborne droplets required to cause infection in 63% of susceptible persons. Well, do we know what it is? Does it vary? It varies and depends on many factors. Well, first of all, on the location of the pathogen which is virus or bacteria in the respiratory tract. I've already mentioned this, that different viruses are located in different places in the respiratory tract. Physiology of the respiratory tract. Each of us has different physiology. We are taller, we are shorter. The same is with our respiratory tract. There are differences. And aerosolation, which depends on this physiology, varies. Stage of the disease, we've heard in relation to COVID-19 that initially it is in the upper respiratory tract and then it moves to the lungs. Type of respiratory activity, as I've just indicated, that, for example, vocalization has higher emissions and the specific virus. So it is complex, but there are risk infection transmission models, and this kind of quantifications have been done for a long time. The classical is the traditional steady-state Wells-Riley model. Now, I'm not going to now go into equations and calculations of what happens in the mathematics of this, but I just wanted to bring this equation of the basic equation from this model, but just to show what the parameters in such modeling are involved. So in the first case is the number of infectious source cases, which means number of sick people. Q, the number of infectious quanta produced per source case. That's what we just discussed a moment ago. The average respiratory ventilation rate of a susceptible person, the duration of exposure, and the volume of infection-free or outdoor air supplied to the room. So that's where the ventilation comes into. So this is the very, very basic equation. And as I said, it's been used. We've used it in an assessment, well, slightly more complex version of this model, but on these principles. For example, to model the ventilation and infection risk in the Prince Charles Hospital in Brisbane. So what would happen in this particular location, lung function laboratory, infection risk for 15 and 45 minutes occupancy. And we did this for influenza, tuberculosis, and rhinovirus. And you can see that the quanta for these different pathogens is different. Very obvious conclusion from this graph is that the higher outdoor air changes per hour, the lower the infection risks, and the higher the quanta emitted, the higher the risk, and also the shorter the duration, the lower the risk. It's kind of common sense, but we've got this here quantified. We've also done this little study when we quantified the infection risk of influenza in a passenger car. In this case, we modeled three settings of this particular car: low, medium, and high. And then the duration of the trip was modeled up to 90 minutes. So you can see how significant differences are in terms of the infection risk dependently on the ventilation and on the time spent. I must say that since then, being in a car with somebody potentially sick, I was very, very careful about putting the air on direct ventilation or opening windows when it was possible. Now, what I presented are in a way still simplistic approaches because they don't take into account the size distribution of the emitted droplets or on the location of the virus in it. When the question started coming at the beginning of this pandemic about the risk, we've worked on this with colleagues from Italy, Giorgio Bonanno and Luca Stabilla, published this paper, Estimation of Airborne Viral Emission, Quanta Emission Rate of SARS-CoV-2 for Infection Risk Assessment. Again, I'm going to show the equation, not to discuss it, to show the parameters involved, to show that this becoming more complex in terms of the number of the parameters. But at the end, if we need to understand what exactly happens and then how to mitigate this, we need to be able to do things like this. So here in this calculation of the viral load emitted, we are taking a few of the different parameters which we didn't include before, in particular the viral load in this sputum. Now, conversion factor defined as the ratio between one infectious quantum and the infectious dose, the breathing rate as before, the volume as the droplet number concentration, and the volume of a single droplet. This is taken from that size distribution, as I explained before. Well, it looks more complicated than before, but it's not really a big deal to this. So we've applied this model to quanta concentrations and risk assessment in a hypothetical pharmacy for exposure scenarios before lockdown and after in Italy. The colleagues were Italian, and at the time we had data for this. We looked at the natural ventilation and mechanical ventilation. And what we have here is the time in this particular pharmacy with the parameters for the pharmacy as they are typical in Italy, number of quanta and the risk. What happens here is an infected individual enters here around minute 10, and another customer comes at the minute 26 and remains for 10 minutes. So we can calculate the risk for this customer dependently on the time spent and dependently on the ventilation, that mechanical and natural ventilation. Of course, there's more to this we could discuss, but this is really to show that we can do things like this. Another aspect which in that particular study we calculated was the reproduction number, 0, again simulated for exposure in the Italian scenarios. So I'm sure by now we know very well what 0 is. And it was derived from the theoretical quanta concentration and the infection risk. So what we have here is the different settings: pharmacy, supermarket, restaurant, post office, bank. Before lockdown, natural ventilation, mechanical ventilation, and after lockdown, when the parameters changed, which we can see that 0 has significantly changed. Well, the next step is what to do this and how to apply these methods for prospective and retrospective assessments. Here I'm showing the steps which are done with this, and this is based on a paper which was just accepted a few days ago, also in the Journal of Environmental Science. So first of all, we need estimation of the probability of infection based on the evaluation of the quanta emission rate, the forward emission approach. We evaluate the exposure to quanta concentration, the dose of quanta received by an exposed susceptible subject, and the probability of infection through a dose response model. So that's the first step. And the second is the individual infection risk and the basic reproduction number. Well, you may ask why we are doing all of this. At the end, the question is what risk will be accepted. It's never 100% risk-free. Even if we get into the car, there's always a risk that there will be an accident. But we accept this risk because it is low. So therefore, we need to be able to quantify the risk, to be able to say, well, can we accept this risk or not? So this is the kind of steps we are taking in this. And we've also looked at scenarios in the prospective assessment. For example, such scenarios can be developed and calculated for the situations in Australian settings. And we've retrospectively applied this to outbreaks in that restaurant, in a restaurant in Guangzhou, and that choir rehearsal in Skagit Valley, which I mentioned a moment ago. So this is the paper. As I said, it's been just accepted. I'll show some images here, not to go into the discussion about this, because we can spend a lot of time discussing the parameters and how it was calculated, what it means. But in relation to this Skagit choir practice, this is one of the graphs which is in our paper. So we've got here the time spent during this rehearsal. By the way, the whole time was 2.5 hours. The number of quanta in the air and the probability of infection. In this case, we've used this particular value of 341 quanta, which is discussed. We don't know really what this value is for this virus being a new virus. But what you can see is that with the time, the number of quanta is increasing, but slightly leveling, which is expected, like with any indoor pollutants, but the risk of infection is increasing quite rapidly. What we've calculated of the infection risk for the entire duration of this practice actually very well reproduces what the infection rate was reported by the study. Now, okay, you can say this is all very good, but how am I going to use this, or how this can be used for any practical application? Not many people would have necessary expertise, time, or willingness to do this kind of things. To make it available, to make available such assessment, we've developed this what's called Airborne Infection Risk Tool. It's located at our website. Actually, this is an exercise between the colleagues from Italy and the colleague from New York, Alex Mikrzewski. And this is a screenshot of what you see when you look at that link. So basically, you don't need to know all these equations which went into the calculations, but you can enter your parameters of the particular location, exchange rate, and so on. And then based on this, calculate different risk for different scenarios and calculate other things as well. This is the version 1 of this risk tool. We are very soon to replace it with version 2. There's much discussion about various parameters used here, because at the end, this is the devil is in the details. But this tool, gradually, with more knowledge we have, is improving and getting better. So, of course, there's been lots of assumption going into generating this, starting from the schematic diagram, which was in our CAD paper, showing, well, it's not still quite realistic, that distribution in the air, but it shows that there's variation, there's lack of homogeneity in the distribution in the real situation. We can't take this into account, so in our tool we needed to make assumptions, and the assumption is the well-mixed concentration of the pollutants. So just two images, what comes, and again, this is for a particular situation modeled, and I'm not showing here all the parameters of modeling, you can find it there. So this is a classroom ventilation rates and required area for students in relation to a risk, and in this case, it's a risk below or above 1%. So we can see here exchange per hour, ventilation rate per student liters per second required area for the student. Or another one calculation of the individual infection risk for passengers during a 15-minute subway ride. That's a New York subway ride. Exchange rate, individual infection risk, maximum occupancy for 0 smaller than 1. So infection risk with the exchange rate, infection risk decreases as expected, and then maximum with increasing number of passengers, it increases. Again, this is something which is expected, but being able to quantify this, being able to say what should be the exchange rate, what is the risk we can accept. This is basically what everybody is asking now, every organization and everybody who is responsible for risk for health and protection of others. To close, I'd say that while we are talking about this pandemic and COVID-19, we should think beyond COVID-19, and to keep in mind that the next pandemic will not be caused by the same virus, but by a virus of different characteristics. Let's hope that it's not going to happen in our lifetime, and let's hope that we are, as a humanity, better prepared for this. Risk assessment and prevention should be conducted for all types of airborne infections, in particular seasonal flu. We don't have to think about the pandemics, but every year we've got epidemics of numerous respiratory infections, which sicken millions, kill thousands, and cause huge economic losses of billions of dollars. So if the risk is quantified, appropriate control measures can be selected in a flexible manner for the specific risks and demands, in particular taking energy conservation into account. I said before that we shouldn't recirculate the air. We shouldn't recirculate when there is a great risk of infection, but on a day-to-day basis without epidemics in mind, of course, we know that this is a very important measure to conserve energy. With this, I'd like to close and thank you for your attention.